They say fate does not shout, it whispers. It shows up in the quiet moments, in the places we were least prepared to look. On a freezing December night, a man with everything met a woman who had lost everything. And in that single moment, both of their lives changed forever. But tell me, why would a homeless stranger hold a billionaire's child like she was her own? And why was she crying? What secret connected them long before that night? Stay with me, because nothing in this story is what it seems. This is the story of Grace Morrow, once a beloved schoolteacher, now homeless, and Edward Harland, a man whose wealth could buy anything except time. But on the night their worlds collided, questions rose like smoke. How did Grace recognize the billionaire's daughter? Why had she kept something hidden in her coat for years? And what truth would shake a billionaire to his core? Before I continue, let me ask you something. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance? Have you ever walked past someone's suffering and convinced yourself it wasn't your problem? Keep that thought close, because this story will challenge everything you believe about worth, compassion, and second chances. Grace Morrow once taught children like they were seeds of destiny. Her classroom glowed with laughter, chalk dust, and the scent of old books. She had a gift, the kind you can't teach or buy. Students who struggled in other classes would bloom under her care. Parents called her an angel. The school called her irreplaceable. But life has a cruel way of testing gentle souls. When Grace's husband, Daniel, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the world she had built began to crumble. She took a leave of absence to care for him, spending every waking hour by his bedside. Daniel had been her college sweetheart, the man who read poetry to her on Sunday mornings and danced with her in the kitchen when no one was watching. Watching him fade was like watching the sun set on her entire existence. The medical bills came in waves, each one higher than the last. Insurance covered some, but not nearly enough. Experimental treatments, specialists, medications that cost more than her monthly salary. Grace sold their car first, then their furniture, then everything that wasn't nailed down. She borrowed from friends, from family, from anyone who would listen. But cancer doesn't negotiate. Daniel passed away on a rainy October morning, holding her hand, whispering that she had given him the best life any man could ask for. Grace buried him with the last of their savings. 2 weeks later, the bank foreclosed on their home. She had nowhere to go, no family left. The few friends she had were struggling themselves. Pride kept her from begging. Shame kept her from returning to the school where everyone knew her as the teacher who had it all together. So Grace disappeared into the streets, carrying only a backpack, a sleeping bag, and one precious item, a children's storybook Daniel had given her on their first anniversary. Now, let me tell you about Edward Harland. If Grace represented everything soft and compassionate in this world, Edward was its opposite. He was a man carved from ambition, discipline, and an iron will that had built a tech empire worth billions. People knew his name. Forbes featured him. Politicians sought his endorsement. But those who truly knew Edward understood that behind the success was a man running from ghosts he could never outpace. His wife, Caroline, had died giving birth to their only daughter, Lily. The doctors had given Edward a choice in those final moments: save the mother or save the child. Caroline had already made the decision for him, whispering with her last breath to save their baby. Edward honored her wish, but the guilt nearly destroyed him. He threw himself into work, building companies, acquiring assets, doing anything to avoid the empty penthouse that echoed with memories of the woman he loved. Lily grew up surrounded by nannies, tutors, and bodyguards. She had every toy a child could want, attended the most prestigious private school in the city, wore designer clothes that cost more than most people's rent. But she didn't have her father. Edward was always traveling, always in meetings, always one phone call away from another deal. He told himself he was building a legacy for her, securing her future. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was hiding from the pain of looking at Lily and seeing Caroline's eyes, hiding from the guilt of choosing his daughter's life over his wife's, hiding from the fear that he had no idea how to be a father. So he hired people to do it for him. And Lily learned early that love, in her world, Grace had been homeless for 8 months when December arrived. She had learned the rhythms of street life, where to find warm grates, which shelters opened on which nights, where the soup kitchens served meals, and most importantly, how to become invisible. That's what society wanted from people like her, invisibility. Commuters rushed past her every morning without making eye contact. Shopkeepers shooed her away from doorways. Teenagers filmed her for social media laughs. But Grace endured it all with a dignity that poverty could not strip away. She spent her days in the public library, reading to stay warm and to keep her mind sharp. In the evenings, she would sit by a fire barrel near an old industrial district where other homeless folks gathered. It was there, on a bitter December night, that she would hum an old lullaby, the same one she had sung to her students years ago. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Her voice carried on the winter wind, a ghost of the woman she used to be. That same night, across town in a penthouse that overlooked the glittering city, 7-year-old Lily Harland was experiencing a loneliness no amount of money could fix. Her father had promised to be home for dinner. He had promised to help her with her school project. He had promised, like he always did. But his assistant called at 6, apologizing on his behalf. Another emergency meeting. Another deal that couldn't wait. Lily sat at the long dining table alone, picking at her meal while her nanny, Mrs. Patterson, scrolled through her phone nearby. The penthouse was decorated for Christmas. A professional crew had installed a 12-foot tree with thousands of lights, but it felt cold. Empty. Lily finished her dinner in silence, then asked if she could play in her room. Mrs. Patterson, distracted by a text conversation, waved her off without looking up. What happened next would change everything. Lily had been thinking about the stray cat she'd seen from her bedroom window for weeks. A scraggly orange tabby that wandered the alley below. She'd named him Marmalade in her head and left food on the fire escape, sneaking bits of chicken and turkey from her plate. Tonight, she saw him again, meowing at the window. Without thinking, driven by a child's innocent impulse to help something that needed her, Lily bundled up in her coat, grabbed her pink backpack, and slipped out while Mrs. Patterson was in the bathroom. The elevator took her down 40 floors. The doorman, assuming she was with someone, smiled and waved. And just like that, a billionaire's daughter walked out into the freezing December night, chasing a cat that had already vanished into the shadows. 15 minutes passed before Mrs. Patterson noticed. Then panic. She searched every room, every closet, every corner of the penthouse, screaming Lily's name. She called building security. They checked the cameras and saw the nightmare. Lily leaving alone. Mrs. Patterson's hands shook as she dialed Edward's number. He was in a boardroom on the other side of the city, about to sign a $50 million contract. When he saw his nanny's name flash on his phone, he almost ignored it. Almost. Something told him to answer. The moment he heard her sobbing voice, his blood turned to ice. "My daughter is missing." 3 words that shatter any parent. Edward didn't remember leaving the boardroom. Didn't remember his driver breaking every traffic law to get him home. All he remembered was the crushing weight of terror and guilt. This is my fault. This is what happens when you choose everything else over your child. Meanwhile, Lily wandered the streets, lost and confused. The city looked different at night, bigger, colder, scarier. She called for Marmalade, her voice getting smaller with each block. She didn't notice the temperature dropping, didn't realize her fingers were going numb. She just wanted to find the cat and go home. But the streets all looked the same. The buildings towered over her like giants. Her breath came out in little clouds, and tears started freezing on her cheeks. She turned a corner into an industrial area, the kind of place children should never be, and that's when her legs started to give out. Hypothermia was setting in. Her body was shutting down. She collapsed near a fire barrel, her small frame crumpling onto the cold concrete. And that's when Grace heard the soft whimper, barely audible over the crackling fire. Grace turned and saw what looked like a pile of expensive fabric, then realized with horror it was a child. She rushed over, her motherly instincts igniting like they'd never left. The little girl's lips were blue, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Grace didn't hesitate. She wrapped her own coat around Lily, the only coat she owned, and pulled the child into her arms, rocking her gently. She rubbed Lily's hands, trying to bring warmth back into them. She sang softly, the same lullaby she'd been humming earlier. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that save a wretch like me. Lily's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glassy. Grace's heart broke. This child, in her designer boots and cashmere coat, was someone's entire world, and she was dying in the arms of a stranger. Grace looked around desperately for help, but the streets were empty. She held Lily tighter, tears streaming down her face, praying to a God she wasn't sure listened to people like her anymore. Then, the screech of tires, blinding headlights, car doors slamming, security guards shouting, and Edward Harland, CEO, billionaire, untouchable titan of industry, running toward her with a fear in his eyes that made him look utterly human. He stopped a few feet away, taking in the scene. A homeless woman, dirty clothes, matted hair, holding his unconscious daughter with a tenderness that pierced his heart. For a moment, neither of them moved. Grace looked up at him, tears still falling, and whispered, "She's burning up." I couldn't leave her like this. I didn't know what else to do. Edward's security team surrounded them, hands on weapons, ready to tear Lily from this stranger's arms. But Edward raised his hand, stopping them. He knelt down slowly, his expensive suit touching the filthy ground, and looked into Grace's eyes. "Who are you?" His voice cracked, raw with emotion. Grace gently transferred Lily into his arms, and Edward felt the warmth his daughter had absorbed from this stranger's body, the body heat that had likely saved her life. Paramedics arrived, checking Lily's vitals, wrapping her in thermal blankets, administering oxygen. She would be okay, they said. Another 30 minutes, and it would have been a different story. Edward held his daughter close, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, overwhelmed with relief and shame. He had almost lost her, lost the only piece of Caroline he had left, because he was too busy, too important, too consumed with building an empire to notice his daughter slipping through his fingers. He looked back at Grace, who was standing now, shivering in just a thin sweater, having given her coat to Lily. He wanted to thank her, to ask her name, to understand how this moment had happened. But then one of his security guard approached, holding something. "Sir, we found this in her pocket." It was a small, faded photograph, worn at the edges from years of handling. Edward took it, and his heart stopped. The photo showed a little girl, around 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair and bright eyes. A little girl who looked almost identical to Lily. Edward's mind raced. Why did this homeless woman have a photo of a child who looked exactly like his daughter? Had she been following them? Stalking Lily? Planning this? His gratitude curdled into suspicion. He stood abruptly, photo in hand, and his voice turned cold. "Explain this. Now." Grace looked at the photo, and her face crumpled. "That's not your daughter," she whispered. Edward's security team closed in tighter. "Then who is it? Why do you have this?" Grace's hands trembled. Her name was Emma. She was my student. 10 years ago. Edward's jaw tightened. "And why would you carry a photo of a student for 10 years? Grace met his eyes, and in hers he saw an ocean of pain. "Because I failed her. Because I couldn't save her. And I promised myself I would never forget." Edward didn't know whether to believe her, but something in her voice, the rawness, the shame, made him pause. His head of security leaned in. "Sir, we should call the police. Have her checked out." Edward nodded slowly. "Take her in for questioning." Grace didn't resist. She had nothing left to lose. "Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever been misjudged? Have you ever told the truth and had no one believe you? Have you ever done the right thing only to be punished for it?" Think about that as this story continues. And before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about justice, compassion, and the invisible people we walk past every single day. Grace sat in a cold interrogation room for hours, wrapped in a scratchy police blanket. Officers asked the same questions over and over. How did you know where Lily would be? How long have you been watching her? What were you planning to do? Grace answered each question with the same truth. But truth without proof is just a story, and stories from homeless people don't carry much weight. She explained that she'd never seen Lily before that night, that the photo was of Emma, a student from a lifetime ago, that she had only tried to help a dying child. But the optics were damning. A homeless woman with a photo of a girl who looked identical to a billionaire's daughter, found holding that same daughter on a deserted street. It looked like a setup, a ransom scheme, or worse. The police didn't charge her, they had no evidence of a crime, but they released her with a warning. Stay away from the Harlan family. Don't contact them. Don't go near their building. Grace walked out into the early morning cold, exhausted and heartbroken. She had saved a child's life and been treated like a criminal. Welcome back to the streets, she thought bitterly. The story, however, didn't end there. By noon the next day, Grace's face was on every news channel, every website, every social media feed. Someone had leaked the story. Homeless woman found with billionaire's daughter. The internet did what it does best. It made assumptions. Half the comments called her a hero. The other half called her a predator. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. She was a kidnapper. She was hired by Edward's rivals. She was a former employee seeking revenge. Grace's photo, taken from the police report, circulated everywhere. People who had walked past her on the street for months suddenly recognized her. Some spit at her. Others left food. Most just stared. Grace wanted to disappear, but there was nowhere left to hide. The shelter she sometimes stayed at turned her away. Too much attention, they said. Other homeless people avoided her, afraid the scrutiny would fall on them too. Grace had never felt more alone. She spent that night under a bridge, the same bridge she and Daniel used to walk across on summer evenings when life was beautiful. She cried until. But across town, in a hospital room where Lily was being kept overnight for observation, something else was happening. Lily had woken up asking for someone. Not her father, not her nanny. She was asking for the woman who sang to her, the woman who held her. Miss Grace, she called her, though Grace had never given her name. Edward sat by Lily's bedside, holding her small hand, and felt a crack form in the wall he'd built around his heart. His daughter had been dying, and a stranger had saved her. Not for money, not for fame, but because it was the right thing to do. And how had he repaid that kindness? With suspicion, with police, with cruelty. Edward was a man used to being right, used to winning, but sitting there watching his daughter sleep, he realized he might have made a terrible mistake. He picked up his phone and made a call. I need you to find out everything about the woman from last night. Grace Morrow. Everything. Within 24 hours, Edward had a file on his desk that made him feel physically sick. Grace Morrow, age 42. Former elementary school teacher at Riverside Elementary. Widowed. Homeless for 8 months following medical bankruptcy and foreclosure. No criminal record. References from former colleagues describe her as dedicated, compassionate, the kind of teacher who changed lives. Edward kept reading. 10 years earlier, Grace had taught at a different school in a rougher part of the city. That's where she had met Emma. Emma had been a bright student, full of potential, but from a broken home. She had been in foster care, bouncing between families who didn't want her. Grace had taken a special interest in the girl, staying after school to tutor her, bringing her snacks, giving her the kind of attention she'd never received. But then Emma got sick, a rare heart condition that required surgery. The foster system wouldn't cover the full cost. The state moved too slowly. Grace had tried everything, fundraisers, grants, her own savings. But it wasn't enough. Emma died, waiting for a surgery that cost less than the watch Edward was wearing. Edward set the file down, his hands shaking. Grace had told him the truth, every word, and he had treated her like a criminal. But there was something else in the file, something his investigator had flagged. Emma's last name, Harlan. Edward's blood turned cold. He flipped back through pages, cross-referencing family records he hadn't looked at in years. And there it was, Emma Harlan, daughter of Edward's younger brother, Michael. The brother Edward had cut off years ago for drug addiction and reckless behavior. Edward hadn't even known Michael had a daughter. When Michael overdosed and died, Edward had been too consumed with his own life, his own grief over Caroline, to ask questions about what Michael left behind. A daughter, his niece. A little girl who had been thrown into the foster system and forgotten by the family that could have saved her. The family that had millions, billions. And Grace, a schoolteacher making $30,000 a year, had tried to save her, had spent her own money, had held Emma's hand as she died, had carried the guilt for 10 years. Edward sat in his office, the city skyline stretched out before him, and for the first time in a decade he wept. Not quiet tears, but deep, shaking sobs. He had been so focused on building, on achieving, on running from pain, that he had become blind to the people suffering around him. His own niece had died in poverty while he signed checks for yachts he never used. And Grace, the woman who had tried to save her, was now sleeping on the streets while he lived in a penthouse. What had he become? What kind of man had he turned into? He picked up his phone and called his head of security. "Find Grace Morrow. Bring her to me. I don't care what it takes. Find her." But finding someone who doesn't want to be found, someone who has learned to disappear, is harder than Edward imagined. Grace had left her usual spots, avoiding the attention, avoiding the cameras. Days passed. Edward grew frantic. He offered a reward for information, put his people on it full time. But Grace was gone. Then, a week after that freezing December night, Lily got sick. It started as a cough, nothing serious. But within hours, she was struggling to breathe. The doctors rushed her to the ER, running tests, trying to figure out what was wrong. Edward paced the waiting room, terrified. They mentioned words like asthma attack, allergic reaction, pneumonia. They gave her medication, but nothing worked. Lily's oxygen levels kept dropping. Edward felt helpless, watching his daughter fight for air, watching the machines beep faster and faster. And then, like a miracle he didn't deserve, Grace walked into the hospital. She had seen the news, heard about Lily's collapse, and despite everything, despite being humiliated and accused, she came. Security tried to stop her, but Edward saw her through the window and shouted to let her in. Grace approached Lily's bed, studied her symptoms for only a moment, and then turned to the doctors. "Has anyone checked her for Harlan syndrome?" The doctors looked confused. "It's a rare genetic condition," Grace continued. "Affects the respiratory system under stress. Looks like asthma, but doesn't respond to normal treatments. You need a specific corticosteroid. I've seen it before." The doctors exchanged glances. How would a homeless woman know about a rare genetic disorder? But Edward knew. He knew because Harlan syndrome ran in his family. His father had it, Michael had it, and Emma had it. It was part of what made her heart condition so complicated. The doctors, with nothing to lose, followed Grace's advice. Within 20 minutes of administering the correct medication, Lily's breathing stabilized. The beeping slowed. Color returned to her face. She would be okay. Edward stared at Grace, this woman in threadbare clothes and broken shoes, who had now saved his daughter's life twice. He couldn't speak. Grace simply smiled sadly and turned to leave. Edward found his voice. "Wait, please, don't go." Grace stopped but didn't turn around. "Why did you come back? After everything I did to you? Why?" Grace's voice was soft. "Because no child should suffer for the sins of adults. Because I couldn't save Emma, but maybe I could save Lily. And because, Mr. Harlan, someone once told me that love isn't about what you have. It's about what you give, even when it costs you everything." Edward crossed the room and did something he hadn't done in years. He got down on his knees in front of another human being. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. For how I treated you. For what my family did to Emma. For all of it." Grace turned, tears in her eyes. "Your apology won't bring her back." Edward nodded. "I know, but maybe I can make sure her death meant something. Maybe I can honor the woman who tried to save her." Grace didn't understand. Edward stood and looked her in the eyes. "I want to help you, not as charity, but as a debt I owe. To Emma. To you." Grace shook her head. "I don't want your money, Mr. Harlan. I don't need a handout. I need a chance. A chance to do what I was meant to do. To teach. To help children who don't have anyone else." Edward smiled for the first time in what felt like years. "Then let me give you that chance. Not a job. Not a favor. A partnership. Help me build something that matters. Something Emma would be proud of." 3 months later, Grace stood in front of a newly renovated building in the same neighborhood where Emma had lived and died. The sign above the door read, the Morrow Academy of Hope, a tuition-free school for children in foster care, children experiencing homelessness, children the system had forgotten. Edward had funded it entirely, but Grace ran it. She hired teachers who understood struggle, created programs that fed bodies and minds, built a place where no child would ever feel invisible again. On opening day, 73 students walked through the doors. One of them was a little girl named Maria, who looked up at Grace with the same hopeful eyes Emma once had. Grace knelt down, smiled, and said, "Welcome home, sweetheart. You're safe here." Edward watched from the back of the room, Lily holding his hand. He had cut back his work schedule by half, started having dinner with his daughter every night, read her stories before bed. He was learning, slowly, what it meant to be present, to be a father. Lily had asked if Miss Grace could visit them on weekends. Edward had said yes, and those Saturdays became sacred. Grace taught Lily to bake, to read with expression, to see people not for what they owned, but for who they were. The media, of course, covered the transformation. Billionaire and homeless woman team up to change lives. It made for a great headline, but those who truly understood saw something deeper. They saw two broken people who had found purpose in each other's pain. Grace had lost Emma, but through Lily and the academy, she found a way to mother again. Edward had lost Caroline, but through Grace's example, he learned what love actually looked like. It wasn't control. It wasn't money. It was showing up. It was sacrifice. It was holding someone in the cold and giving them your only coat. 1 year after the school opened, on the anniversary of that December night, Grace and Edward stood together at Emma's grave. Edward had found where she was buried, an unmarked plot in a city cemetery. He had commissioned a beautiful headstone. Emma Harlan, beloved niece, cherished student, forever remembered. Grace placed flowers, white lilies, Emma's favorite. Edward placed a photo of the new school. And together, they stood in silence, two people who had been strangers brought together by tragedy and transformed by grace. Now let me ask you, if you had been in Edward's position that night, would you have trusted Grace? Or would you have done what he did? It's easy to judge from a distance, but when fear grips your heart, when your child's life hangs in the balance, how do we choose between suspicion and faith? And what about Grace? If you had been her, after losing everything, after being treated like garbage by society, would you have come back to save Lily a second time? Would you have risked more humiliation, more pain for a child that wasn't yours? These aren't just questions about characters in a story. These are questions about who we are, about how we treat the invisible people around us. The homeless person on the corner, the struggling single parent, the kid in the back of the class nobody notices. Grace was invisible until Edward needed her, and even then, his first instinct was suspicion, not gratitude. How many times do we do the same? How many times do we walk past someone suffering and tell ourselves it's not our problem? Here's the truth that this story reveals. We are all one tragedy away from becoming Grace. One medical emergency, one job loss, one accident. The gap between stability and the streets is thinner than we want to admit. And we are all one wake-up call away from becoming Edward, realizing too late that the things we chase mean nothing compared to the people we ignore. Grace didn't need Edward's money. She needed to be seen, to be believed, to be given a chance. And Edward didn't need more wealth. He needed to be humbled, to remember that being powerful doesn't make you right, that having everything can still leave you empty. Their collision that December night wasn't an accident. It was a reckoning, a moment when two lives that should never have intersected were forced to confront the truth about themselves and each other. And in that confrontation, both were redeemed. So I'll ask you one more time. What would you have done if you were Grace, shivering by that fire, and you saw a dying child? Would you have given your coat? Would you have held her knowing it might cost you everything? If you were Edward, would you have seen past the dirt and the poverty to the heart underneath? Or would fear have blinded you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if this story moved you. Tell me if it changed how you see the people you pass every day. And if you made it this far, if you stayed with Grace and Edward through every twist, every heartbreak, every moment of hope, then you're the kind of person this world needs more of. Someone who doesn't look away. Someone who believes that every life has value, regardless of wealth or status. Someone who understands that fate whispers in the quiet moments, in the places we are least prepared to look. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories that don't just entertain, but challenge you. Stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Because Grace and Edward's story is real in the ways that matter. It's happening right now, in your city, on your street, maybe even in your own heart. The question is, what will you do about it?